A storm brews. The air was thick with humidity, and the ominous rumble of distant thunder echoed through the night. Raindrops danced erratically on the windshield of Marcus James' well-worn sedan as he navigated the winding, dimly lit streets of Crescentville. He had just finished his late shift at the community center where he volunteered, mentoring at-risk youth. Exhausted but fulfilled, Marcus's mind was already drifting to thoughts of the warm bed that awaited him at home. The radio played faintly in the background, a soothing melody blending with the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. Crescentville, though a small city, was no stranger to tension, especially in its more isolated neighborhoods where racial disparities ran deep. Marcus had grown accustomed to the subtle, and sometimes blatant, prejudices that permeated the town, but he refused to let them define his life. As Marcus approached an intersection, the distinct flash of red and blue lights shattered the peaceful monotony. The staccato chirp of a siren followed, signaling him to pull over. His stomach dropped. He glanced at the speedometer, 38 miles per hour in a 40 zone. He knew he hadn't violated any traffic laws. Instinctively, he checked his mirrors and signaled, pulling his car to the curb. "Stay calm," Marcus murmured to himself, inhaling deeply to steady his nerves. Just another routine stop. But as the shadow of the approaching officer grew larger in his side mirror, Marcus felt an unsettling chill creep down his spine. Officer Brian Hayes was a name known throughout the city for all the wrong reasons. Marcus recognized him instantly, a tall, imposing man with a reputation for aggression, particularly toward people who looked like Marcus. The officer's polished black boots clacked against the wet asphalt as he approached. Hayes radiated an aura of authority, his hand resting conspicuously on the holster of his service weapon. His lips curled into a thin smile, devoid of warmth, as he tapped on the window. "License and registration," Hayes demanded, his tone sharp and clipped. Marcus rolled the window down halfway, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him years ago. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" Hayes tilted his head slightly, his smile growing faintly sinister. "You're driving awfully slow for someone in a rush, don't you think?" Marcus frowned, confused. "I wasn't in a rush, officer. The rain makes the road slick. I was being cautious." Hayes' eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus as if searching for a reason to escalate. "Cautious, huh? Or maybe just trying to avoid attention. Mind if I take a look in the car?" The question wasn't really a question at all. Marcus knew this game. He had heard stories from friends, seen the videos online, read the headlines. This wasn't about traffic violations. This was about intimidation. "I'd prefer not to, officer," Marcus replied carefully. "Unless you have a specific cause, I'd like to go about my evening." Hayes chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "I'm the one who decides what's cause for concern around here. Step out of the car." Marcus hesitated. The rain was coming down harder now, streaking the windows and distorting the figure of Hayes standing outside. He glanced around the empty street, hoping someone, anyone, might appear as a witness. But there was no one. The darkness swallowed the road ahead, leaving only the faint glow of streetlights and the oppressive weight of Hayes' presence. Reluctantly, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the rain. The cold droplets soaked through his jacket almost immediately, clinging to his skin like icy needles. Hayes motioned for him to move to the rear of the car. "Pop the trunk," Hayes ordered, his voice dripping with authority. Marcus stiffened. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't consent to a search." "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Hayes' jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing further. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. "Do you think this is up for negotiation? Open the trunk, or I'll do it myself." The tension in the air was palpable, each raindrop adding to the growing pressure. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to argue. He knew better than to provoke the situation. But Hayes was undeterred, his smirk widening as he reached for the trunk latch himself. Meanwhile, across the street, a young woman named Erin Clark walked briskly under her umbrella. A journalist by trade, she had an eye for injustice and a knack for being in the right place at the right time. She noticed the scene unfolding and instinctively pulled out her phone, positioning herself discreetly to record. As Hayes opened the trunk, his smug expression faltered for a moment. Inside was nothing but a neatly organized set of tools and an old leather briefcase. He grabbed the briefcase and turned back to Marcus. "What's in here?" Hayes asked, shaking it slightly for emphasis. "Personal documents," Marcus replied firmly. "Nothing illegal." Hayes ignored him, flipping the latches open. He rummaged through the contents, his hands pausing as he pulled out a single sheet of paper. His expression shifted from arrogance to confusion, and then to something Marcus couldn't quite place, fear. The rain continued to pour, masking the stunned silence that fell between them. Erin, still recording from the shadows, zoomed in on Hayes' face as he read the document aloud. "Notice of termination." Hayes' voice wavered slightly. "Reason, misconduct, racial profiling, abuse of power." Marcus furrowed his brow, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Hayes' hand trembled as he lowered the paper, his face pale. The document wasn't Marcus. It was addressed to Brian Hayes. Erin gasped softly from her hiding spot, her mind racing. She didn't yet know how this would end, but one thing was certain, this was far from over. The paper trail. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning the narrow street into a glistening river of reflections. Marcus stood rooted in place, staring at the pale-faced officer in front of him. Hayes' hands trembled slightly as he held the incriminating document, its text illuminated by the hazy glow of his flashlight. Marcus' initial confusion gave way to a sharp realization, this wasn't just any piece of paper. "Officer Hayes," Marcus said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What exactly are you holding?" Hayes snapped out of his daze, his expression hardening as he stuffed the paper back into the briefcase. "That's none of your concern," he snapped, slamming the trunk shut with unnecessary force. "What's important is what else you're hiding in this car." Marcus took a step forward, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm not hiding anything, but you clearly found something you didn't expect. Care to explain what's going on?" "Step back." Hayes barked, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the hilt of his sidearm. His face was a storm of anger and panic, the confident facade he had worn earlier now fractured. "This is official police business." Marcus raised his hands defensively, his pulse quickening. "Official police business? You're digging through my personal belongings without cause, and now you're withholding whatever it is you just found. I have every right to know." Across the street, Erin Clark stood frozen under her umbrella, the video still rolling on her phone. The journalist in her recognized the gravity of the moment, this wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone awry. Something deeper was at play, and Hayes was unraveling before her eyes. Hayes stepped closer to Marcus, his voice low and venomous. "Let me make this clear. You don't ask questions. You answer them. Understand?" Marcus met his gaze, unwavering despite the fear gnawing at him. "I understand my rights, officer. And I know you're crossing a line." The tension between the two men crackled like the distant thunder overhead. Hayes' breathing was heavy, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. He knew the document in his hand could ruin him. It was his own termination letter, a paper trail leading back to the very complaints he had always dismissed as baseless. Complaints about racial profiling, unlawful stops, and intimidation tactics, all tied to his badge. The questions burned in Marcus' mind. How did that document end up in my car? Was this some kind of setup? But one thing was clear, Hayes' fear wasn't just about the paper. It was about exposure. "Turn around," Hayes ordered abruptly, breaking the silence. "Hands on the car." Marcus' jaw tightened. Are you arresting me now? On what grounds? Resisting an investigation, Hayes snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Marcus hesitated, the rain dripping from his curls onto his face. He glanced around, noticing for the first time a figure across the street, partially obscured by a red umbrella. The faint glow of a phone screen confirmed his suspicion, someone was recording. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. I'm not resisting, Marcus said firmly. But I'm not going to stand here and let you violate my rights without justification. Hayes' face darkened, his hand twitching near his belt. For a moment, Marcus thought he might escalate further, but the officer suddenly froze. His radio crackled to life, breaking the standoff. Unit 42, this is dispatch. Status check. The voice on the other end was calm, but it carried an edge of authority that couldn't be ignored. Hayes grabbed his radio, his fingers visibly shaking. Dispatch, this is Unit 42. Everything's under control, he replied, his voice clipped. There was a pause, followed by a pointed response. Copy that, Unit 42. Just a reminder, all stops require a report within the hour. Over. Hayes gritted his teeth, his gaze flickering toward Marcus. Understood. Over. Marcus watched as Hayes lowered the radio, his movements rigid and deliberate. The cracks in his composure were widening, and it was clear he was losing control of the situation. Across the street, Erin stepped forward slightly, her phone now trained more directly on Hayes. Look, Marcus began, his tone softer but resolute. You and I both know this is out of line. Whatever you found, it doesn't belong to me. Let's deal with this the right way. Hayes' eyes flickered with something akin to desperation. He looked at Marcus, then at the briefcase in his hand, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And if you know what's good for you, you'll keep it that way. With that, Hayes turned on his heel and strode back toward his cruiser. Marcus watched him go, his heart pounding. He wanted to demand answers, to call Hayes out for his blatant misconduct, but he knew pushing further could put him in even greater danger. Wait, Marcus called out, taking a cautious step forward. You can't just leave like this. But Hayes ignored him. He opened the door to his cruiser, tossed the briefcase onto the passenger seat, and slammed the door shut. The red and blue lights flared back to life, illuminating the rain-soaked street as the car pulled away. Marcus stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He felt violated, angry, and confused. But most of all, he felt a burning need for justice. As the cruiser disappeared into the night, Erin stepped out from her hiding spot, her red umbrella standing out against the gray backdrop. She approached cautiously, her phone still in hand. Hey, she called out, her voice cutting through the rain. Are you okay? Marcus turned to her, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. You saw that? I recorded it, she said, holding up her phone. Everything. That officer, he was way out of line. Marcus nodded, his chest tightening. Thank you. I don't know what just happened, but I think that video might be the key to figuring it out. Erin offered him a small smile, though her eyes remained serious. Whatever it is, we'll get to the bottom of it. I promise. The rain continued to fall as the two strangers stood together, united by the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, the truth wouldn't stay buried for long. The predator unmasked. The night in Crescentville was eerily quiet as Officer Brian Hayes drove through the rain-soaked streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The incriminating document lay in the passenger seat beside him, a ghost of his past that had no business reappearing. Hayes' jaw clenched as his mind raced, replaying the events of the evening. He had controlled countless stops like this one before, his authority rarely questioned, his actions largely unchallenged. But this time was different. This time, the prey had turned the spotlight on the predator. The radio crackled, pulling Hayes from his thoughts. Unit 42, report to the station immediately. Supervisor request. Hayes swallowed hard, his stomach knotting. He knew exactly why the station wanted him back. Word of his behavior at the traffic stop must have traveled fast, and now the scrutiny he had long managed to avoid was closing in. His cruiser slid into the parking lot of the precinct, the tires splashing through puddles. Hayes sat motionless for a moment, the hum of the engine the only sound in the enclosed space. He glanced at the briefcase again, its open latch revealing the damning letter inside. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He grabbed the document, folded it roughly, and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Whatever happened next, he needed to control the narrative. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with tension. Officers moved briskly, their voices low and their faces serious. Hayes walked toward the supervisor's office, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. He forced a confident expression, though his heart pounded like a drumbeat in his chest. Captain Margaret Hensley, a seasoned officer known for her no-nonsense approach, was waiting for him. She sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes fixed on Hayes as he entered. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her hands were folded neatly on the desk in front of her. "Close the door," she said, her voice curt. Hayes obeyed, the door clicking shut behind him. He stood stiffly, avoiding her gaze. "Take a seat, Officer Hayes," Hensley continued, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Hayes hesitated before sitting, his posture rigid. "Captain, if this is about—" "Save it," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've already received a call from a concerned citizen. There's a video circulating of your traffic stop tonight. Care to explain?" Hayes' stomach dropped. His worst fear had been realized. Someone had recorded the incident. His mind immediately conjured the image of the woman with the red umbrella. She must have been filming the whole time. "I was conducting a routine stop," Hayes said, his voice steady. "The suspect was acting suspiciously, and I had reason to believe he was hiding something." Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Suspiciously? Driving cautiously in the rain is suspicious now? And since when does suspicion justify opening a trunk without consent or a warrant?" Hayes bristled. "With all due respect, Captain, I was following my instincts. It's what we're trained to do." Hensley leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "We're trained to follow the law, Officer Hayes. Not to fabricate justifications for abusing power. This isn't the first time I've had complaints about your conduct." The words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to protest, but Hensley held up a hand again. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen the complaints. Dozens of them. Racial profiling, unnecessary force, harassment. I've been covering for you longer than I should have, and tonight's incident is the last straw." Hayes' face turned red. "With all due respect, Captain, I've done nothing but uphold the law. Those complaints are baseless." Hensley leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Baseless? Then how do you explain this?" She reached into a drawer and pulled out a printed document. Hayes recognized it immediately. It was a copy of the termination notice he had found in the briefcase. His heart stopped. "How did you get that?" he demanded, his voice rising. Hensley's eyes flashed with anger. "That's the wrong question, Officer Hayes. The right question is, why was this termination notice, with your name on it, found in the trunk of a civilian's car tonight?" Hayes stared at her, his mind spinning. He hadn't thought it was possible, but the situation had just gotten worse. "I don't know how it got there," he stammered. "Someone must have planted it." "Convenient," Hensley replied coldly. "But here's the thing, this notice isn't new. It's dated over a year ago. It was signed and approved but never processed. Care to explain that? Hayes' palms began to sweat. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. It must be a mistake, he said weakly. I've never seen that document before tonight. Hensley studied him for a moment, her expression hard. Mistake or not, I've already started an internal investigation. Your badge and gun are to be surrendered immediately. Effective now, you're on unpaid leave pending the outcome. Hayes shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. You can't do this. I've dedicated my career to this department. And that's exactly why I'm doing it, Hensley snapped, rising to her feet as well. Your behavior has put this department at risk for too long. If this investigation confirms even half of what's in that video, your career is over. Hayes stood there, trembling with rage and fear, as Hensley extended her hand. Badge and gun, officer. With shaking hands, Hayes unfastened his badge and holster, placing them on the desk. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was deafening. Hensley sat back down, her gaze never leaving his. Dismissed, she said. Hayes stormed out of the office, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had his carefully controlled world unraveled so quickly? He barely noticed the curious glances from his fellow officers as he left the precinct and stepped back into the pouring rain. His car felt suffocating as he sat inside, gripping the steering wheel. The folded document in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He pulled it out, unfolding it with trembling hands. Notice of termination. The words mocked him. His misconduct had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it this time. But a new thought began to take shape in his mind, a dangerous, desperate thought. If this was the end of his career, he wasn't going down alone. Hayes' lips curled into a bitter smile as he started the car. The rain lashed against the windshield as he pulled out of the parking lot, his destination clear. He was going to find Marcus James. If this was the end of the line, he'd make sure Marcus paid for it. The storm outside matched the storm brewing inside Hayes' mind. What Hayes didn't realize, however, was that Marcus and Aaron were already 2 steps ahead. In a small diner on the other side of Crescentville, Marcus sat across from Aaron, watching as she replayed the video she had captured earlier that night. This is it, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. This video proves everything. Aaron nodded, her expression resolute. And we're not stopping here. The world's going to see this. Little did they know, Hayes was already on his way. The collision of truths. The rain had tapered off into a faint drizzle by the time Marcus and Aaron settled into a quiet booth at Crescentville's only all-night diner. The aroma of stale coffee and greasy food filled the air, but neither of them seemed to notice. Aaron's phone lay on the table between them, the screen playing back the video of Officer Hayes' tirade. Her red umbrella, now closed and leaning against the booth, was still dripping water onto the floor. This is explosive, Aaron said, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the video. Not just because of what he did to you, but because of that document. That termination notice, it's the smoking gun. Marcus sipped his coffee, his fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But how did it end up in my trunk? That's the part one can't figure out. Aaron tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. It had to be intentional. Someone wanted you to have it, but why? And how could they even pull that off without you noticing? Marcus shook his head. I don't know. I haven't opened that trunk all week. I figured everything in there was just my tools and work stuff. Aaron glanced around the diner, ensuring they weren't being overheard. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of truckers at the counter and a waitress refilling ketchup bottles. Who else has access to your car? No one, Marcus said firmly. At least, no one I'd trust with it. But I've been parking on the street lately since my building's garage has been full. Anyone could have had a chance to mess with it. Aaron nodded slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. Whoever did this, they knew what they were doing. That document being in your trunk wasn't just a coincidence. It's a setup. The question is, for whose benefit? Marcus frowned, his gaze drifting out the window to the glistening streets. It doesn't feel like it was meant to help me. If anything, it feels like a trap. Before Aaron could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a soaked baseball cap. His movements were deliberate, his presence unsettling. Marcus stiffened, instinctively recognizing the figure before the man even removed his hat. Officer Brian Hayes. Stay calm, Aaron whispered, her hand brushing Marcus' arm as if sensing his tension. He won't do anything here. Too public. Hayes scanned the diner, his eyes locking on Marcus and Aaron. His lips twisted into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes as he made his way toward them. The wet squeak of his boots on the linoleum floor sent a chill down Marcus' spine. You're a hard man to track down, Hayes said, his tone mocking as he stopped at their booth. He glanced at Aaron, his smirk faltering slightly when he saw her phone still on the table. And you must be the journalist. I saw your handiwork. Aaron folded her arms, her voice cool and unwavering. If by handiwork you mean documenting your abuse of power, then yes, that's me. Hayes' jaw tightened, his smirk vanishing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just here for a friendly chat. Friendly, Marcus said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Right. Because harassing me earlier wasn't enough? Hayes ignored the jab, pulling a chair from a nearby table and sitting down uninvited. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, his eyes narrowing as they met Marcus. You and I both know this situation isn't what it seems. That document? It shouldn't exist. Funny, Marcus shot back. Because it's got your name on it. Hayes' nostrils flared, but he forced a tight smile. Let me make something clear. That document was supposed to be buried. Someone's playing games, and you're just the unlucky pawn. If you're smart, you'll back off now before you get yourself into trouble. Marcus' temper flared. Trouble? You planted that document in my car and then tried to intimidate me into silence. You don't get to play the victim here. Hayes' smile turned into a snarl, his composure slipping. You think I planted it? If I'd done that, do you really think I'd be here trying to clean up this mess? No, this is someone else's doing. Someone who wants both of us to go down. Aaron leaned forward, her voice sharp. Why don't you tell us who, then? You're the one with skeletons in the closet. Start talking. Hayes glared at her, his hands curling into fists on the table. You don't understand the kind of people I'm dealing with. This goes higher than me. They don't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Convenient excuse, Aaron retorted. Blame the shadowy higher-ups and hope we forget you're the one harassing innocent people. Hayes slammed his hand on the table, drawing the attention of the waitress and the truckers at the counter. He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. You think I like being a scapegoat? I've spent my whole career doing what I was told, and now they're throwing me under the bus. Marcus stared at him, a strange mix of anger and pity stirring within him. If you're so sure you're being set up, why come after me? Why not go after the people pulling the strings? Hayes barked a bitter laugh. You think I haven't tried? They've got connections everywhere, judges, politicians, even within the department. People like me don't get second chances. Aaron exchanged a glance with Marcus, her expression skeptical but curious. And what exactly do you want from us, Officer Hayes? Sympathy. I want the video, Hayes said bluntly, pointing at Aaron's phone. If that video gets out, it's game over for me. But it's not just me. Whoever's behind this will come after you, too. You think you're untouchable because you've got the truth on your side? Think again. Aaron raised an eyebrow. Let me get this straight. You're asking us to destroy the only proof we have of your misconduct because you're scared of the people who might be pulling your strings? Hayes didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. Marcus shook his head, disgusted. You've got some nerve. You've been using your badge to bully people for years, and now you want us to protect you. Hayes leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Fine. Keep the video. But don't say I didn't warn you when things start falling apart. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the diner, leaving behind a trail of water and tension. Erin let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Well, that was illuminating. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He's scared, but not just of us. He's scared of whoever's behind that document. Erin picked up her phone, replaying the video again. We've got enough here to blow this wide open. But we need to be smart about how we do it. Marcus looked out the window, his jaw tightening. Whatever happens, I'm not backing down. Hayes might be just another cog in the machine, but it's time someone held that machine accountable. The rain picked up again, the steady rhythm on the glass echoing the determination building between them. Whatever lay ahead, Marcus and Erin knew they were stepping into a storm far bigger than either of them had anticipated. The depths of deception. The next morning, the gray skies over Crescentville mirrored the unease in Marcus' heart. Despite the diner confrontation with Hayes the night before, he knew their ordeal was far from over. If anything, Hayes' erratic behavior only confirmed that they had stumbled into something much larger than a rogue officer's misconduct. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the now viral video Erin had uploaded overnight. Her decision to release it had been bold but calculated. The world needs to see this, she had said with conviction. The comments were already piling up, some supportive, others skeptical, but the impact was undeniable. The video had brought national attention to Crescentville's underbelly, and now, the whole city was watching. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but one call stood out. The caller ID read, unknown. Marcus hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He finally answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was deep, measured, and chilling. Mr. James, I trust you've enjoyed your moment of fame. Marcus' grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? That's irrelevant. What matters is the trouble you've stirred up. You should have kept your head down. The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stared at the phone, his chest tightening. Whoever the caller was, they clearly wanted to intimidate him, and they were succeeding. Meanwhile, Erin was in her apartment, poring over the video comments and digging into public records. Her journalistic instincts were in overdrive, pushing her to uncover more about Hayes and the Crescentville Police Department. She had already found multiple articles detailing prior allegations against Hayes, complaints of racial profiling, unwarranted searches, and excessive force. But what caught her attention was a pattern. Every complaint had been quietly dismissed without any formal investigation. Someone's protecting him, she murmured to herself, jotting down notes. Erin's research eventually led her to a name that seemed to appear repeatedly in the background of Hayes' career, Deputy Chief Walter Grayson. A 25-year veteran of the force, Grayson was known for his tough-on-crime stance and close ties to local politicians. Erin's gut told her this wasn't a coincidence. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. Erin, I just got a call, someone threatening me. Her stomach dropped. What did they say? Something about stirring up trouble and keeping my head down. They hung up before I could say anything. Erin's voice hardened. That's not surprising. Whoever's behind this doesn't want us digging deeper. But listen, I think I've found a lead. There's a high-ranking officer, Deputy Chief Grayson, who seems to have been pulling strings for Hayes. I'm digging into him now. Be careful, Marcus said. If they're threatening me, they won't hesitate to come after you. Erin smiled grimly. They'll have to catch me first. Later that afternoon, Aaron and Marcus met at a public library, choosing a neutral location in case they were being followed. Aaron had brought a stack of printouts in her laptop, eager to share her findings. "Here," she said, spreading the documents across the table. "This is what I've got so far." Marcus leaned in, scanning the papers. One was an internal memo from the Crescentville Police Department, dated 2 years earlier. It detailed a disciplinary hearing for Hayes that had been abruptly cancelled at Grayson's insistence. Another was a local news article about a whistleblower who had accused Grayson of covering up police misconduct, only to mysteriously recant their statement days later. "This is damning," Marcus said. "But it's not enough. We need something concrete." Aaron nodded. "That's why I reached out to someone who might have more information. A former officer who left the force a few years ago. He agreed to meet with us." "Who is he?" "His name's Daniel Alvarez," Aaron replied. "He worked under Grayson for a decade before he left. He says he knows things that never made it into official reports." Marcus frowned. "Do you trust him?" Aaron hesitated. "I don't know yet. But he's our best shot at getting the full story." That evening, Aaron and Marcus drove to a secluded diner on the outskirts of town to meet Alvarez. The former officer was sitting in a corner booth, his back to the wall, a wary expression on his face. He was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. "You Aaron Clark?" he asked as they approached. She nodded, sliding into the booth with Marcus beside her. "And this is Marcus James." Alvarez glanced at Marcus and nodded. "I saw the video. You've got guts, kid. But you've also kicked a hornet's nest." Marcus leaned forward. "Then help us figure out who's behind it." Alvarez sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just Hayes. He's a small fish in a much bigger pond. The real problem is Grayson. He's been running a network inside the department for years. Covering up misconduct, silencing whistleblowers, protecting guys like Hayes." "Why?" Aaron asked. "Power," Alvarez said simply. "Grayson's not just protecting cops. He's protecting politicians, business owners, anyone who keeps his pockets full. And in return, they keep him in power." "Do you have proof?" Marcus pressed. Alvarez hesitated, glancing around the diner. "I kept records, emails, memos, even audio recordings. But when I tried to go public, I got shut down fast. My family started getting threats. I had no choice but to leave." "Where are the records now?" Aaron asked. "They're in a safe place," Alvarez said. "But if I give them to you, you need to promise me something. You take Grayson down, and you don't stop until the whole system comes crashing down." Aaron met his gaze, her voice steady. "You have my word." As Aaron and Marcus left the diner, Alvarez's words echoed in their minds. The weight of what they were taking on was immense, but neither of them was willing to back down. "We're going to need a plan," Aaron said as they got into her car. Marcus nodded. "And a lot more help." Unbeknownst to them, a black SUV was parked a block away, its engine idling. Inside, 2 men in dark suits watched as Aaron's car pulled away. One of them picked up a phone and made a call. "They've got Alvarez on their side," the man said. "What are your orders?" A voice on the other end replied coldly. "Follow them. And if they get too close, make sure they don't get any further." As the SUV's headlights flickered on and began to follow Aaron's car, the game escalated. Marcus and Aaron had uncovered the truth, but now they faced a new challenge, surviving long enough to expose it. The reckoning. The morning sky broke with streaks of pale light fighting through heavy clouds, casting Crescentville in a dim glow. The storm from the night before had cleared, but for Marcus and Aaron, the turbulence had only just begun. Alvarez had handed them a lifeline in the form of a USB drive containing years of meticulously collected evidence against Deputy Chief Grayson and his network of corruption. The contents were explosive, emails, audio recordings, and detailed logs of payouts, cover-ups, and threats. But it wasn't just a matter of exposing the truth anymore. They were being hunted. The chase. Erin gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as she maneuvered her car through a labyrinth of backstreets. The black SUV had been tailing them since they left the diner the night before, its tinted windows and aggressive driving style a silent promise of danger. Beside her, Marcus clutched the USB drive like a lifeline. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. "To a friend," Erin replied, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "She's a cybersecurity expert. If anyone can get this evidence out to the world without tipping off Grayson's people, it's her." Marcus nodded, his chest tight with anticipation. "How much further?" "Not far," Erin replied. "Just hang on." Behind them, the SUV gained speed, its headlights bearing down like a predator closing in on its prey. Erin's heart pounded as she swerved onto a side street, narrowly avoiding a collision with a parked car. The SUV followed, its engine roaring. "This is insane," Marcus shouted. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore." "They don't care about subtle," Erin replied, her jaw clenched. "They care about stopping us." She turned sharply onto a narrow alley, the tires skidding against the slick pavement. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following, its size making it difficult to navigate the confined space. Erin saw her chance. "Hold on," she yelled. She floored the gas pedal, accelerating toward the end of the alley. Just as the SUV began to close the distance, she veered sharply onto the main road, leaving the larger vehicle momentarily trapped in the alley's tight confines. "Did we lose them?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. "For now," Erin said, her grip on the wheel loosening slightly. "But they'll be back." The upload. They arrived at a small apartment building on the edge of the city. Erin parked the car and ushered Marcus inside, her movements quick and deliberate. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they climbed the stairs to the third floor. Erin knocked on a door labeled 3C. A moment later, it opened to reveal a petite woman with cropped purple hair and a nose ring. She wore a hoodie emblazoned with the words "Hack the Planet" and greeted Erin with a smirk. "You're late," the woman said, stepping aside to let them in. "I was starting to think you got caught." "Almost did, Rena," Erin replied, handing over the USB drive. "But we've got what we need. Can you make it go viral?" Rena took the drive, her expression turning serious. "Let me see what we're dealing with." She led them to a cluttered desk piled with empty coffee cups and wires snaking around multiple monitors. Plugging in the drive, she began sifting through the files, her eyes widening as she read. "Holy, this is big," Rena muttered. "Like, career-ending, prison sentencing big. Can you get it out there?" Erin asked, leaning over her shoulder. "Not just out there," Rena replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I can encrypt the files, set up timed releases to multiple platforms, and route it through enough proxies that they'll never trace it back to us." "Good," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Because people need to see this." As Rena worked, Erin and Marcus kept an eye on the street below. The SUV hadn't reappeared, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus' thoughts turned to Hayes, the disgraced officer whose arrogance had inadvertently led to this moment. Where was he now? Marcus wondered. Was he part of the pursuit, or had he already been cast aside by Grayson's shadowy network? The confrontation. As the files began uploading to the cloud, the door to Rena's apartment burst open with a thunderous crack. Two men in suits stormed in, their expressions cold and professional. Erin barely had time to react before one of them grabbed her, slamming her against the wall. Marcus lunged forward, but the second man blocked his path, shoving him backward. "Stay where you are," the man growled, pulling out a gun and pointing it at Marcus. "What do you want?" Erin demanded, struggling against her captor. "The drive," the man holding her replied. "And any copies you've made." "You're too late," Rena said calmly, spinning her chair to face them. "The files are already uploading. And once they're out there, there's no pulling them back." The men exchanged a glance, their confidence wavering. The one holding Erin tightened his grip. "Then we'll make sure none of you talk." A new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." All eyes turned to the doorway, where Officer Brian Hayes stood, his gun drawn and aimed at the intruders. His face was a mask of determination, but there was something else in his eyes, guilt. "Hayes," Marcus said, incredulous. "Let them go," Hayes commanded, stepping further into the room. "You don't want to add murder to the list of crimes you're already trying to cover up." The men hesitated, clearly taken off guard. "You're in no position to make demands," one of them snarled. "Maybe not," Hayes replied. "But the precinct knows I'm here. If I go missing, it's only going to make things worse for you and Grayson." The mention of Grayson made the men flinch. Reluctantly, the one holding Erin released her, and both men slowly lowered their weapons. Hayes kept his gun trained on them as he gestured toward the door. "Get out," he said. The men glared at him but obeyed, retreating down the hall. Hayes closed the door behind them and turned to face the others. "What the hell are you doing here?" Erin demanded. "Cleaning up my mess," Hayes said quietly. "I saw the video. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I can help make this right." Marcus stared at him, torn between anger and reluctant gratitude. "You've got a lot to answer for, Hayes." "I know," Hayes replied. "And I'll answer for it. But first, let's make sure Grayson does too." The fallout. The files finished uploading, and within hours, the story exploded across social media and news outlets. Headlines screamed of corruption, misconduct, and a vast conspiracy within the Crescentville Police Department. The evidence was irrefutable, and public outrage was immediate. Deputy Chief Grayson was arrested within 48 hours, his network of allies crumbling under the weight of the revelations. Hayes turned himself in, offering to testify in exchange for leniency. His testimony proved invaluable, exposing layers of corruption that had been hidden for years. Marcus became a reluctant hero, his bravery in standing up to injustice inspiring others to speak out. Erin's reporting catapulted her career to new heights, but she remained focused on holding power accountable. As for Crescentville, the city faced a long road to recovery. But for the first time in years, there was hope, a glimmer of light breaking through the storm. The reckoning was complete, but the fight for justice was far from over. Marcus, Erin, and even Hayes knew that the cost of truth was high, but it was a price worth paying. Together, they had sparked a revolution, proving that even the most entrenched systems of power could be dismantled when people refused to stay silent. And so, under a clearing sky, the first seeds of change were sown.